Today, we will be exploring two stories from the Talmud and discussing their relevance to the current time period that we are marking. The first story from the Talmud begins that Rabban Gamliel, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Yehoshua, and Rabbi Akiva were walking in the vicinity of Rome. Now, for a bit of context, these stories will take place after the destruction of the Second Temple. So we know that after the first temple was destroyed, the Jews went down to the Babylonian exile, but then they came back, rebuilt the temple until it was destroyed for a second time by the Roman Empire. So why were these sages walking towards Rome? Well, Rome was the government that ruled over them. Not only did they destroy the Beit HaMikdash, but they actually ruled over them in kind of like a cruel, callous way, right? And a big tax had been imposed on the Jewish people, and they were, on a sense, on a political mission to negotiate the tax because it was really choking the people, right? And as they're walking towards Rome, from a distance, they hear the sound of a bustling metropolis, right? A thriving, prosperous city, right? And the sages begin to weep. Rabbi Akiva starts to laugh. They turn to Akiva and they say, Rabbi Akiva, why are you laughing? Rabbi Akiva responds, why are you crying? They say to him, these barbarians who bow down to idols, they burn incense of all gods. They destroyed us, but they are living in peace and security. While our temple was burnt, should we not cry? He says to them, that is exactly why I am laughing. If people who violate the will of God and behave in such an evil manner, how much better will those who act according to his will be rewarded? So that's the first story. The Gemara relates another story. And in the story, we have the same characters, right? There's three sages and Rabbi Akiva, and they're walking towards Jerusalem. When they reach Mount Scopus, where they could see the Temple Mount, they tear their clothing as a sign of mourning. And when they arrive at the Temple Mount, they see a fox running out in the area where the Holy of Holies had once been. These sages can't deal with it. They begin to weep. Again, these three sages begin to weep, but Rabbi Akiva, the fourth sage, he's laughing. And again, they say to him, why are you laughing? And in typical Jewish fashion, he responds with a question, why are you crying? And they say, why are we crying? This spot, this location, where once only the holiest of holy, right? The Kohen Gadol was able to enter under the strictest of circumstances, such a holy place, and now there's a fox traversing this area. How can we not cry? And Rabbi Akiva answers, for this very reason, I am laughing. Why? Because there are two prophecies that are dependent on each other. One is a negative prophecy from the prophet Uriah. Uriah prophesies in the first temple, and the other one is a positive prophecy from the prophet of Zechariah. And we know that those two prophecies are linked together. Uriah's prophecy is one of calamity, of destruction, and Zechariah's prophecy as one of rebirth and renewal, a time where elderly people will walk on the streets of Jerusalem. There will be children playing at their feet. Akiva says, because these two prophecies were linked, I always worried, right? That if the negative prophecy wouldn't become true, then for sure the positive prophecy wouldn't come true. Until I saw the fulfillment of Uriah's prophecy, i.e. a fax traversing the Kodesh HaKodashim, I had doubts whether Zechariah's prophecy would come true. After the other sages hear this from the mouth of Akiva, they turn to Akiva and they say, Akiva, nechamtanu, nechamtanu. Akiva, you have comforted us, you have comforted us. Now, these two stories from the Talmud are perplexing, right? I don't know if you have any questions, but there are many questions raised on those stories. So if you have any questions on the story, what you think would be considered perplexing about the story, Feel free to put it in the chat box if you're following along on Zoom. Okay. Okay, so question number 1. Why did Rabbi Akiva ask them why they are crying, right? It's obvious. The Roman capital is blossoming after they committed so many atrocities, so many crimes against humanity. It's not fair. Not only that, a fox emerges from the Holy of Holies. How can you not cry? We are talking about Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest sages. What was he really asking? The next question, was Rabbi Akiva really doubtful that the prophecy of Zechariah would come true? We see that Akiva is comforted when the first part of the prophecy comes true. But we know that there's a premise that sages teach us that every prophecy, every good prophecy has to come true, even if it's dependent on another prophecy. So surely Akiva knew that, right? Next question. There are many prophecies that talk about the destruction. Why does Akiva specifically highlight and quote the part of the prophecy about the fields being plowed over? What is significant about that significant prophecy? And finally, we know in the Gemara and the Talmud, there are never any words that are wasted. So when it tells us a story, many times in the Talmud, it'll refer to, the sages as the Zakenim, the elders, or the Chachamim. Why is every single name spelled out here? Now, these are some of the questions that the Rebbe poses. We are going to see that all these answers are very much correlated. What Rabbi Akiva is really asking the sages about their weeping is, what changed? We know that the Beit HaMikdash had been destroyed. We know we are in exile. So what triggered you to start crying? You can't say you're crying because of the general concept of foreign rule, right? Because they are traveling to Rome. They are very much, including Rabbi Akiva, they're very much aware of their situation. But what now? What changed? In the second story, we see something similar, right? We know they mourn because as soon as they came to Mount Scopus, they tore their clothing in mourning. They lived with this reality in a very real way. What's different? What changed? The sages tell Rabbi Akiva, of course we understand that the temple was destroyed by this superpower of the reigning world. In a sense, it's more comforting than, let's say, the temple had been destroyed by a small, weak nation, right? That would have been humiliating. But now to see the Romans prospering after what they had done, to see the Chilul Hashem, that's what triggered them into the weeping. How could they have the luxury of the prosperity? And again, when they see the fox traversing, even though they were in a state of mourning, but they cried again at the utter Chilul Hashem. And Rabbi Akiva didn't look at it from that perspective. He didn't look at it from the perspective of salt on open wounds. He saw the opposite perspective. It's not that Rabbi Akiva doubted that the words of Zechariah would come true. It's that he wondered to what extent would they come true. Now that he sees the intensity of the destruction and how much the enemy is flourishing, he is comforted. When our day will come, to the degree that we suffered, we will flourish so much more. So there's an idea in Judaism that states, Yerida Tzarach Aliyah. Every descent, right, is for the sake of ascent. I think we've all experienced this on a micro level when we experience a setback, but then we broaden our lens and we see that this temporary setback was actually a springboard for overall progress. On another note, what paralyzes us most sometimes about taking action is that fear of failure. We can program our brain to see that everything that happens, no matter how bad it seems, is part of the process. That can actually help neutralize the fear. Hi, Emily. Okay, now let's take this a step further. Why is Akiva choosing the part of our Uriah's prophecy that highlights that Zion will be plowed as a field? So I don't know a lot about farming, but from the little I know about farming, that seemingly destructive act of plowing is the first step of rebirth and growth. And that's what Rabbi Akiva is sharing with the sages. Not only is a destruction going to lead us back to construction, but in the very act of plowing lies already the seeds of the rebirth, right? Now, as I was studying this really resonated me, especially during the times that we are going through, right, with this pandemic and given the current events. Now, one thing that we are seeing through these times is not only will we, God willing, gain the strength to overcome these challenges, right? But perhaps the process is part of the healing. Now, I'm not saying this to mitigate any of the pain, the hardship, the suffering that anyone experienced. But throughout this pandemic, we've seen things like ventilator manufacturers releasing their patents to their competitors just for the reason of saving lives. Countries, sharing information, resourcefulness, and innovation. That in itself exposed a beauty that is maybe as unprecedented as the actual pandemic. And maybe this brings us to why the Gemara mentions the names of the sages and the relevance to the stories, right? The Talmud wants to show us that their identities shaped their reactions. So we have Rabbi Gamliel, who was a Nasi. He was a prince from the Shevet of Yehuda, right? Rabbi Elazar, who was a Kohen, and Rabbi Yehoshua, who was a Levi. In other words, they all had very prestigious lineages, right? Who is Rabbi Akiva? Rabbi Akiva, at 40 years old, he was completely illiterate. He didn't know the alphabet. He was a pauper. He goes on to marry this prestigious woman, Rachel, who sees his incredible potential and empowers him to see his potential. And that was really Rabbi Akiva's perspective. Instead of being demoralized and thinking, who am I? I don't stand a chance. I'm going to go and study Torah. This is the situation that God put me in. It must be for a reason. No, instead he says, I have a part of God within me, and within me lies this tremendous potential. And he goes and he studies Torah. It says he starts to study alphabet with little children. He goes on to become the greatest sages of all times with tens and thousands of students. Rabbi Akiva looked at the potential and he realized that you can actually transform the present by looking towards the future. By the way, you can even see this not to get into this, but in the Gemara, you can see it in the way he rules from a legal standpoint, that you can actually transform the present by looking at the future. And I think we all had these role models and teachers who maybe saw the potential in us, and maybe that propelled us to become a better version of ourselves and achieve things we didn't think was possible. And this is Akiva's style. So this futuristic style shapes Rabbi Akiva in so many ways. Rabbi Akiva's perspective here teaches us to look beyond what meets the surface, right? He's not just looking at the devastating scene of the fox traversing where the Kodesh Gadashim once stood, or the fact that the people who tried to destroy us are prospering. No, he's looking beyond what meets the surface. In every scenario and every challenge, that's how Rabbi Akiva operates. And that's why maybe it's important to say the names of the sages, the characters of the story. Unlike the other sages that he was with, whose success was maybe very linear with their prestigious, lineage, Rabbi Akiva had to challenge the status quo. Rabbi Akiva taught us, perseverance and always remembering our past, but at the same time transforming the present with the future in mind. And that's how he's able to look at these incidents with such a different perspective than the other sages that he was with. Now, to end off with another story, and then we'll tie it all in. They say that Napoleon the Great was once walking in a Jewish ghetto in France. And he's walking with his minions, his advisors, his officers, and they hear the sound of wailing, crying, lamenting, coming from this small synagogue in the Jewish quarter of France. And Napoleon is intrigued. He turns to his advisors and he says, "What's this crying? What's going on?" They go check out the scene and they say, "Well, it's the Jewish people crying in there. They're crying about the destruction of their temple. Today is a day, Tisha B'Av." And Napoleon says, "A temple was destroyed? Their temple? What temple? What are you talking about? Why was I not informed about this?" And they're like, "Napoleon, hold your horses. This temple that they're crying about was destroyed 1700 years ago." And they're kind of laughing at the Jewish people for being so dramatic about something that happened such a long time ago. All of a sudden, Napoleon becomes very quiet and very serious. And he says, "A people that still mourn a temple that was destroyed 1700 years ago will be destined to survive and have it rebuilt." And that brings us back to these two stories from the Talmud, where we see that crying about the destruction and remembering is very much part of our tradition. You know, I read that Jewish people, we don't have a history, we have like a collective memory, right? It's not about monuments and museums. It's about really remembering and living our past. But at the same time, what we learn from Rabbi Akiva's perspective is that it's not enough to just be demoralized about our past. We also have to look towards the future. And when we go through challenges and when we go through hard times, especially I think it's relevant nowadays, we should channel some of Rabbi Akiva's perspective, where he didn't get stuck in the misery. He looked to the future to innovate, use creativity, realize it's really part of a master plan. And not only will, it pass, not only Gam Ze Ya'avar, everything passes, but more than that, it can become a springboard. The hard difficulties in life can become a springboard for success and happiness. And within the process itself lies these seeds of rebirth. And if we really channel a difficulty properly, although it's easier said than done, and it's appropriate to be sad and to mourn, that's very much part of our tradition. But at the same time, as Jews, we've always done both. Remembered our past, but worked towards a brighter future. So with that, I am going to say goodbye, and may we merit to see the Beit HaMikdash rebuilt in our times, and may our pain turn into happiness and our sadness into joy, and have an awesome day. Thank you for joining me today. Bye.